Hi, welcome everybody to the Student Accessibility Services New Student Insight session, and welcome to the class of 2030. My name's Nate Gondelman. I'm the Director of Student Accessibility Services. I've worked here for over 20 years now, and I'll be presenting alongside my colleague, Erin Massey, who's an accessibility specialist with our office. And kind of our goal tonight is really to be able to kind of go over the basics of what our office does and kind of some of the differences between high school and a university environment, how to get accommodations in place and what that looks like here at UVM. And Erin and I will probably present for half an hour or so, and we'll leave plenty of time at the end for Q&A. So you'll notice in the Teams that you're currently in, there's a Q&A section, so feel free to leave your questions there as we go along, and we'll answer them individually at the end, and we'll stay as long as we need to make sure each and every question is asked. And then, of course, Erin and I will share our contact information at the end, so if anybody has questions that are specific to kind of a student or to a confidential situation, we're happy to address those with you outside of this presentation as well. So just kind of an overview of what we'll be doing in this workshop is we're going to talk about the differences between high school and UVM and some of the big kind of transitional pieces that are involved with that. We'll talk a little bit about our Accommodate portal, which is our kind of new online hub that we've just launched this summer, where students will always go to kind of get started with our office, but also to notify faculty about accommodation letters and things like that. We'll talk about documentation, which is critical to establishing eligibility for students. And so we'll talk a little bit about what types of documentation to submit to our office. We'll talk about accommodations and kind of the process by which we determine what a student is eligible for, kind of what the goal and the purpose of accommodations are in a university setting. We'll also talk about the rights and responsibilities of a student, because those certainly shift in a university environment. And we'll talk about the role of faculty, how to interact with them. And we'll talk about expectations for students at UVM, as well as some personal academic advice. And as I mentioned, we'll have plenty of time for Q&A at the end. I'll also mention that we have ASL interpreters with us for this event. Obviously, as an accessibility office, we want to foreground accessibility in everything that we do on a proactive basis. And so in addition to that, in the chat, I've shared a real-time transcription link. And so for folks that are looking to get an a text version of what we're discussing today, you can just click that link right there and the text will show up in real time. And we work with a excellent cart vendor who's been providing us these services for over a decade, that's based in Vermont. So feel free to access that. I also want to note that at the end of this session today, we will caption this and post it directly on our website. It'll also be available on the new Student Insight session website as well, for folks that want to catch up with it, or for anybody that doesn't have everybody here that they want to view it tonight. You'll be able to access it on demand at any time. So kind of an overview of what our office does. So the primary role of our office is to provide accommodations for students. And it's worth noting that we are now the Office of Accessibility Services as of January 2025. So we actually provide accommodations to faculty and staff as well as members of the university community. But tonight we're going to focus on student accessibility services and our role in providing accommodations to students. And primarily that occurs in the classroom with academic accommodations. I'm guessing most folks here have a history of using academic accommodations, but we also provide accommodations in a variety of different contexts and settings. And that includes for exams, for housing, and for kind of extracurricular activities that a student might be involved with as part of their role at UVM. And if students are involved in clinical or practicum settings, we can provide accommodations in those contexts as well. It's worth noting that we have a staff of accessibility specialists. So each student is assigned a specialist that they work with, and that's kind of their point person with our office. Generally, unless students are in health sciences, they can be assigned to any specialist because of some unique specificities with health sciences. We do have a particular specialist, Laura Clemens, who works with students who are in College of Nursing and Health Sciences, as well as the College of Medicine. But otherwise, any specialist can work with any student. And that specialist is going to be the person that the student has their introductory meeting with, the person that reviews their documentation, and then it'll be that student's point person throughout their time at UVM to go to connect with any questions regarding accommodations. And specialists are also really adept at linking students up with other resources on campus. And so as valuable as it is, as we know, for students with disabilities to get connected with our office for accommodations, it's equally valuable for students to be connected with a lot of other different resources on campus. We'll talk a little bit later about some examples of that. Ebooks is another good example of what we provide. So essentially, ebooks are kind of any accessibly formatted text. And so for students that are using a text-to-speech software, we can take any hard copy textbook or any kind of image-based document and convert it to a text-based document that is compatible with a software that does text-to-speech. We have several that we provide to students directly, free of charge here at UVM. If students have their own preferred software that they want to continue using, that's certainly fine as well. We also provide deaf and hard of hearing services for students, including ASL interpreting, type well transcription, and CART transcription. And then adaptive technology. So there are a lot of students who, depending on kind of what their disability is or kind of what their access needs are, may require a specific type of technology. And if that's related to their ability to kind of access any part of their experience here at UVM, that's something that our office will work with students to provide. So that's not an exhaustive list of what we do, but those are just kind of some key examples I wanted to highlight, and we can touch on more later. Now, in terms of our role and responsibilities, so we provide services to eligible students that are enrolled at UVM. So primarily, I know that folks that are here tonight are families and students that are going to be entering kind of their first semester at UVM, but we work with any student that's taking any type of course at UVM, even if it's only one course that doesn't have to be part of a degree program. And part of our responsibility is to establish a student's eligibility. And so we do that two different ways. Through the narrative of the student, we want to know what a student's history is, what their personal experiences are. We want to hear in a student's voice, what has worked for them, what hasn't. In addition to that, though, we will need documentation to assess eligibility for accommodation requests. And we do have a process by which students can work with our office on a provisional basis for certain accommodations if they don't have documentation up front. While we ultimately do need documentation, we don't want that to be a barrier for students to get started with our office. And so frequently students will work with our office kind of initially. They'll get set up with services based on their narrative. Again, they may not be eligible for all accommodations until they can get their documentation in, but that does allow a student to kind of get the ball rolling even while they're working on getting paperwork in from their provider, which we know sometimes can be a bit of a hassle. And that's one of the reasons why it's great you're all here tonight, because if you're attending this now, you'll have plenty of time, if you haven't already, to get that documentation into our office prior to the start of the semester. Now, based on that narrative and documentation, we make an assessment as to the appropriateness and feasibility of accommodations and a student's eligibility. And so oftentimes that's based on a student's history of accommodations. It's not always a copy and paste. A lot of times, because of some of the differences between high school and college, there are certain accommodations that are provided in high school that are more oriented towards success than access. And so those might not be able to be provided in a college setting. We can talk more about that. But in addition to a student's history, we'll really look at what a student's functional limitations are. That's primarily what we're trying to identify. And because of functional limitations, there's generally access barriers that can be addressed via an accommodation that's provided by our office. And there's an interactive process, which is really the core of what we do, involving student accessibility services, students, and faculty. And essentially, what happens is students will notify their faculty of their eligibility for accommodations. If a faculty member has a concern that that fundamentally alters the course in some way, there's an interactive process between our office, the student, and the faculty member to come to an agreement about, whether or not that accommodation is indeed a fundamental alteration. If it is, what alternatives that we can provide. The fundamental alteration piece is not something that comes up particularly frequently, but it is worth noting that students can sometimes be eligible for an accommodation, but based on the expectations of a particular course, that it might not apply in a given course. Kind of an easy example of that is if a student has extended time, which is one of our most common types of accommodations. If you're taking a CPR course, it kind of goes without saying that extended time would not be appropriate in that, and it would be a fundamental alteration to that particular course. So our role in kind of that process is really to kind of be the arbitrator between the student and the faculty member. And when students are interacting directly with faculty, there's a hierarchy there. And so our office is really designed not to be student advocates, but to kind of help address that hierarchical imbalance between students and faculty and make sure there is a fair decision that is in compliance with ADA law that's being implemented. And we also want to, help students become good self-advocates. We know that students are entering UVM, on a continuum of comfort level with self-advocacy. Some students are really involved with their accommodations in a K through 12 setting, and some students, may be really hands-off and leave that to their family. And, that's fine either way, but in UVM setting, it's really important for the student to kind of take ownership of their accommodations because they're going to have to take the initiative. And while students can authorize our office to communicate with parents or family members or providers, ultimately the student is going to have to take the initiative for our office to be able to work with them. And so we want to make sure that students, leave UVM with the skills necessary to, advocate for themselves and kind of get accommodations in place after they leave UVM, whether that's in graduate school or in a professional setting, since accommodations are not something that ends for a student as an undergraduate. Now, getting into some of the mechanics of our office, I mentioned the Accommodate portal during the overview at the beginning. And we actually just switched to Accommodates. Is a brand new database that's offers much more functionality and versatility. It really has kind of brought our office into the 2020s. We started it in mid-May so that we can kind of work out all the kinks prior to the start of the semester, and we've really achieved that at this point. And if folks haven't already, I encourage you to go to the website that I have listed there, which is go.uvm.edu/accommodate, and complete our getting started form. That's really the kind of ticket to open the door into our office. Students will fill that out and just give us a little bit of information. And then we follow up within 2 business days about getting an appointment set up with one of our accessibility specialists. After you fill out that form, there's also a page where you can upload documentation. So if you have an electronic copy of your documentation available, you can upload that right on the spot. You can also sign a release to allow us to speak with any family members or providers that you would like. Again, that's the student's decision, but that's something you can always change at a later date if you like. And if you don't have documentation, it's entirely fine just to fill out our getting started form and get a meeting set up, and we can address the documentation piece later on in the summer. Once you get that meeting set up with an accessibility specialist, what that really is designed to do is to kind of get all of your accommodations in place now over the summer so that when you arrive at the end of August, you can really kind of hit the ground running for your courses, and you don't have to get accommodations set up when you're kind of adjusting to college life and making new friends and things like that. And so we have plenty of time to do that over the summer. And by doing that on the first day of classes, you'll be able to kind of send notifications to your faculty. Those are called semester requests about what you're eligible for. From that portal, you can also access notes. If you have a peer note-taking accommodation, If you have ebooks, you can also submit requests for your for accessible versions of your textbooks or any articles that you might need. And then exam accommodations are through a separate database that'll link through Brightspace, which is the learning management software that UVM uses, called Register Blast. And for students that have exam accommodations, we'll provide you instructions closer to the start of the semester on how you can get those set up. Since generally for students that are using exam accommodations, you'll want to take your exams in our exam proctoring center, where we can provide extended time, reduced distraction environment, any other type of exam accommodation that you might have, which generally faculty are not able to provide in a standard classroom setting. Now, I have been kind of teasing this larger idea of disability services and kind of the distinction between high school and college. One thing that I really want to focus on is that accommodation requirements are very different in high school versus college. There are some similarities, but the law really shifts. And so in high school, things like IEPs are kind of much more designed for a student's success. And at the university level, it's really designed to enforce access and to give students kind of an equal opportunity to succeed, but it doesn't necessarily relate to the outcome. So we certainly want all students to be successful, but our role is to make sure that a student's functional limitations based on a disability are considered, and so that they have just as much opportunity to succeed as a student who might not have those functional limitations. And now is a good time to kind of point out that we work with almost 1 in 4 students on campus. I think that's one of the things that makes UVM really unique, is that we have a really high proportion of students that use our services across the country. Accessibility offices have seen their numbers increase over the last decade or so, but that proportion is really unique to UVM. And so I think that that's, beneficial in a way, because faculty are really accustomed to providing accommodations in the classroom, and all of our campus partners like Residential Life are really familiar with working with our office around a lot of different accommodations, and there isn't really the type of stigma that I know that is present in some other institutions around that. And so I really encourage folks to get started with us early on, because we find that students have the most success if they get started with us prior to the start of their first semester. And there is no deadline. We have second semester seniors that get started with us, and that's entirely fine. But if you get set up with our office, you have everything in place. And so you don't have to wait until you might hit a crisis point, in which case you still can get started with us. But it does involve some lag time to get your documentation sent in, and to get us meetings set up with a specialist, and then to get accommodations in place. And those are the types of things that are just a little bit different than high school. And it's really on you as the student. If you decide to not engage with our office on a semesterly basis, that is your right as a student. We want to provide agency to students since you're adults. But it's really in your interest to kind of take advantage of the accommodations that you are legally eligible for. And again, I cannot emphasize this enough, these are designed to give you equal opportunity to succeed as much as any other student. And I know some students might be reluctant from the transition to high school or college to continue with accommodations. But as I always emphasize to students, we provide accommodations to faculty and staff as well. So there's a good example kind of inside of our office that accommodations are something that goes well beyond kind of just your undergraduate educational experience. In terms of documentation requirements, I mentioned that this is an important part of establishing eligibility with our office. In addition to that narrative, you'll want to get documentation sent in, and that is really designed to explain the functional impact of your disability in an academic context, or if you're asking for housing accommodations in a residential life context. And that can take the form of one of our verification forms that's listed on our website. We actually have a whole link to various different forms for academic accommodations, housing accommodations, emotional support animals that can be filled out by a provider that you work with. I know a lot of students that are attending here tonight might have IEPs or 504 plans. Those are very helpful to submit as well, and can generally establish eligibility for a student. And certainly if you have an evaluation like a neuropsych evaluation that an IEP is based on, those are always really good to submit as well. We can be pretty flexible with, you know, documentation that is on the older side, but it's best if we have documentation that's within the last 3 years, because that way we'll know the students are evaluated by adult measures. And even if you have something that's kind of on the older side in terms of an evaluation, you can always get one of our verification forms completed by a provider to kind of supplement that and give us some more up-to-date information on your diagnosis and any functional limitations that you are experiencing. And in terms of accommodations themselves, as I mentioned before, we're looking to provide equitable access, not an unfair advantage to students with disabilities. And we really take a case-by-case individualized approach to establishing eligibility. So we have a lot of students that have similar diagnostic profiles that work with our office, but if you take two students that have the exact same set of diagnoses, they might be receiving different accommodations. We really don't want to take a formulaic approach to where, okay, a student with this diagnosis gets these accommodations, because every student is different. And we know that disability and accessibility barriers manifest themselves differently for each and every student. And so we take a case-by-case approach. But one thing we do try and do as an office is we take a really consistent approach to how we review documentation. And we make great efforts as a staff to make sure that we are consistent, and we have internal committees, and all of our specialists, I think, are really good at ensuring that regardless of who a student works with, that whichever specialist they're assigned to, they're going to be eligible for the same accommodations based on the documentation and narrative that they provide. And so that's one of the biggest kind of factors that we work on as a team internally on a year-to-year basis, is making sure that we're on the same page as an office about, an individualized approach, but kind of through a consistent process where we're always evaluating functional limitations in the same way. And as I mentioned before, any accommodation, even if a student is eligible for it, cannot compromise an essential component of a course, a program, or activity. And again, that's something that is determined through an interactive process with our office and the student and the faculty member. It's also worth noting, to my point earlier about the need to kind of get started with our office early, accommodations can't be applied retroactively. So even if a student is eligible for accommodations, regardless of kind of what their diagnosis is and the types of accommodations they need, we can never have a faculty member implement those retroactively. That's a courtesy on their end if they do that. But by law, accommodations cannot be retroactive. So I cannot emphasize enough the fact that even if you have accommodations in place and you decide not to use them, that's totally fine. But it's much better to do that than to realize after the fact, halfway through the semester, that you want to get accommodations in place. And then lastly, for students that are working with our office, if you get accommodations through SAS, it's worth noting that those may or may not be transferred to another institution. Each institution, I think, takes a slightly different look at, a student's eligibility. And so we have kind of our internal process that I was talking about earlier between our specialists and kind of the internal committees that we have. But oftentimes we have students who apply for, GREs when they're juniors and seniors, or kind of any other entrance exam for a graduate program. And you never want to assume that you're going to get the same accommodations in another institution, or if you're, taking a summer class in a different institution back home or something like that. That's something that I recommend getting started on early, because though our office will always provide supporting documentation and letters to let other institutions know what a student has received at UVM, each institution kind of reserves the right to go through their own internal process to determine accommodation eligibility. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Aaron Massey.
Thanks, Nate. Hi, everybody. My name is Aaron Massey. I use he, him pronouns. I am an accessibility specialist at Student Accessibility Services. I have been in this position for about 4.5 years. Many, many years ago, I was a student at UVM and graduated from the University of Vermont and got a degree in theater production. I'm also the parent of a UVM student who just graduated this spring, and is going off into the great big world. So I'll kind of I've had a lot of hats at UVM. I'm super excited to be at UVM and to be doing the work that Nate and I and the other specialists do. I love helping. We all love helping. And so super excited to be here and to give you guys information tonight. Just an important note, there's a lot of information that we're going to sort of talk about and sort of touch base on, but there's lots of depth to those things. And so we won't be able to give you sort of all the information. So we really encourage you to reach out to us afterwards. We're going to provide you with our contact information. Absolutely happy to answer questions, schedule meetings, point you in the right direction for different resources. So yeah, just know that we're available for that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the rights of students under the Americans with Disabilities Act and Section 503 of the 1974 Rehabilitation Act. Those are the two primary laws that sort of govern what we do. So Nate talked about this a little bit in terms of a student potentially being eligible for accommodation, but that accommodation potentially bumping up against the essential elements of a course and what we call a fundamental alteration. So part of our process when we are determining eligibility, when we're supporting students with accommodation implementation, when we're working with professors around those things, is this phrase that we use, which is reasonable and appropriate. So in order for an accommodation to be reasonable and appropriate, uh, it has to essentially remove or alleviate a barrier that the student is experiencing. So we can't provide an accommodation, as Nate mentioned, just because it makes things a little easier or it's more comfortable. That's not really the lens that we're looking through. Sometimes an accommodation does make things easier or more comfortable, but the purpose of the accommodation is really about removing that access barrier. So an example I use a lot, I have ADHD and did not know that I had ADHD as a student. And so there were a lot of things I was not very adept at when I was at UVM, and a lot of things that I really probably could have benefited from an accommodation for, I just didn't know. And so um, those things that I wasn't good at, if they rise to the level of what we call a functional limitation, it's something that's sort of impairing the student's ability to do the things they need to do, then we're looking at an accommodation to try to support them. So, for me, I really could have benefited from a peer note taker because I really struggled to listen to a lecture and absorb the information that the teacher was presenting while I was taking notes. I could take notes and they'd be pretty decent notes, or I could listen to the lecture. But to do both of those things, I was missing information. And so a lot of times I didn't have access to what I needed. And so I really could have benefited from some kind of a note taking support, like a peer note taker, someone who could have provided me a copy of notes so that I could compare and contrast what I had been able to produce for notes to find out areas maybe where I missed some information and then would want to touch base with the professor and reach back out to them. So whenever we're looking at how an accommodation is being applied, we're using that sort of reasonable and appropriate perspective. The other thing I think that is just important is there are lots of different ways that people might need accommodations at UVM or in the world. And so their access can be different depending on where you are. So in the classroom, you might have a functional limitation that requires an accommodation. In housing, in the dining hall, there can be so many different ways. And so we really take a very holistic approach, not only about individuals and wanting to make sure that they are seen and heard for who they are, but in terms of accessibility. And so whenever a student is experiencing a barrier, something that's challenging, that's preventing them from doing what they're doing, we want them to reach out to us and talk to us about potential accommodations. So the processes for those things are relatively similar. We require the narrative, the documentation. Sometimes, as Nate mentioned, we have these internal committees that help us make determinations for accommodations that are maybe running up against things like limiting factors. So a single housing is a great example. We unfortunately do not have a single housing availability for every student on campus. So for students that need a single, we have a process that they go through for us to determine eligibility based on that. Other times, the committee is looking at trying to get a broader lens on the request because the accommodation potentially could bump up against a fundamental alteration, or there are other factors that just make it so that we really want to take a broader look than just an individual specialist making a determination. So we always communicate that stuff up front to students whenever they're asking us about an accommodation. We will describe sort of the process for each accommodation and what are the steps they need to take, and then we try really hard to support them the entire way through that, even to the point where, and I don't know if this comes up later in the conversation or not, but I'm going to talk about it now anyway. Sometimes students aren't eligible for an accommodation. So anytime that we make a determination that a student isn't eligible, the student always has a right to appeal. And there's a process for that. And so the process of determining eligibility isn't a sort of a one and done. It can be a sort of a longer term interactive process, even within our internal processes. So I think that's really important to know. I think the other thing too is that Nate talked about Dr. Laura Clemens, who works with students in the College of Nursing, College of Medicine. In certain environments, accommodation that might be reasonable and appropriate in one class is not reasonable and appropriate in another, and that is really goes to that conversation about fundamental alteration. There are just certain circumstances where an accommodation just can't be applied because the expectations of the situation don't allow for it to be applied, or it maybe needs to be applied in a different way, or maybe we have to look at a different accommodation. So it can get pretty convoluted at times, but this is what we do every day, and we feel confident that we can work with the student, with their professor, with their providers to try to best understand the student's individual needs and give them access to what they need. And sometimes, as Nate talked about in terms of the differences between high school and college, sometimes those accommodations in high school just are very different at the college level. Sometimes they're not an accommodation at all. They're actually another resource. And so there are a lot of resources that are available, and we'll talk about some of them near the end of the presentation. But we part of what we pride ourselves in doing is making sure that students have access to all of the things that will make their experience not only accessible, but give them the best opportunity to earn their degree and to work towards their goals. And those other resources sometimes can be really, really important for that. Um, uh, the other thing I think that we do a really good job of, and we don't necessarily talk about it a lot, but I think because we do it, when it does need to come up, I think it really helps students, is that we take confidentiality and privacy very, very, we hold that with great regard. People are coming to us with a need, a disability related need. And a lot of times that comes with stigma or trauma or just sort of negative experiences they've had in the past. And we don't want to continue those negative experiences. We want them to have a positive and uplifting experience. And so knowing that your information is confidential, knowing that we're not going to be sharing your information, for a lot of folks, that provides some relief and allows them to potentially be more vulnerable than they might be or they've been in the past. I've had many students who've come and talk with me, and they reveal stuff and they're like, "Oh, I don't know if I should tell you this." And I'm like, "You can tell me whatever you feel comfortable telling me, because I'm protecting anything that you say to me. The law protects it. We don't share it with anybody without your permission." And so I think that that's just really important. The law is different. So where you go to your doctor, you're going to be protected by like HIPAA. At the University of Vermont, your privacy is protected by FERPA. It's just a different version of that type of law. But essentially, the other element I think that's really important, especially for families, providers to know, we can't communicate with families or providers without consent from the student. So, if you feel as a family member that you need to be able to communicate with us about your students' needs, it's really important that your student make sure that they give us permission to do so. And the other thing I think related to that is that everything is very siloed at UVM. So we don't just talk to everybody about everything. So if you come and talk to us about accommodations, We're not going to communicate that to student health services or counseling and psychiatry services. That's all. Everybody sort of has their own little zone. We work with all of those offices, but again, we want to protect the students' privacy. We want to keep things confidential, and without the student's permission, we're not going to share details of their case. And generally, I think students find that they once they've sort of provided that conduit for communication, it really helps when, especially when students are struggling sort of across a lot of different factors. You know, they're not just struggling with an accommodation, but they're struggling more generally with their mental health or their physical health. You know, being able to talk openly with other offices to help create sort of coordinate care can be really, really helpful. But again, we won't do any of that without the student's explicit permission. All right. So, in terms of student responsibility, so Nate talked about this a little bit. College is really different than high school. A lot of the scaffolding that's built into high school isn't built into the college level experience. The need for students to be independent, to self advocate, all of that stuff sort of rises when you get to college. Um, so in terms of accommodations, Nate said the number one thing that we say a lot, which is early and often, right? The sooner you reach out and connect with us, schedule that meeting with your specialist, the sooner we can have these conversations, get everything in order so that by the time fall rolls around, which is not that far away, everybody, just as a little note, there's going to be a lot of stuff that you're going to have to do between now and then. There's that checklist you're getting from admissions and from orientation. You're going to have to go through orientation, and that's just a lot of information that's coming at you. So getting the sort of accommodations piece sort of done and set up so that you don't have to worry about that while you're acclimating to all of the other things you need to acclimate to. Where am I going to do my laundry? Where's the best meal hall? You know, how do I get into a club? You know, there are all of these other things that go along with being at college. We want the accommodation to be just a natural support that's just sort of there for you, and you know what to do and how to do it, so that then you can really focus on your classwork, meeting people, really enjoying the college experience to the best of your ability. Um, the other thing that I think is important, just in terms of like meeting with a specialist, is that sometimes it's a one and done. Sometimes students come in, they provide their documentation, they give us their narrative, we determine eligibility, and then they learn the system and off they go, and we never see them again. Other students have different needs. Other students need regular check-ins, or they just feel better communicating with us about, you know, making sure we're up to speed on what's going on for them. Sometimes students needs change. Students will come in needing certain accommodations, and then they may need different accommodations once they get to UVM. So our process is ongoing. So we'll meet with students as much as we need to in order for them to get their needs met in terms of accommodations. But I have a lot of students who will reach out and be like, "Hey, Aaron, I know you said something about this, but I can't remember who you told me to go to for X." And I'll be like, "Oh yeah, no problem. We will send an email for them. We will give them a link to a resource." There's lots of different ways that we can support students, but the most important part of all of that is the student. Right? The student has to engage in this. As much as families want to support or providers want to support, everything really comes from the student. We can't move forward with some things without the student's engagement. So, you know, if you have a need, if you need help, let us know. We're happy to help. And there are lots of resources on campus that are also happy to help. So I think it's really important that you build those self advocacy skills as soon as you can. Um, the really important piece that Nate mentioned about accommodations not being retroactive. Um, don't wait until you need the accommodation to go through our process. I always say it's better to have an accommodation that you don't need than to need an accommodation you don't have. Lots of students transition to college having had accommodations, thinking like, I want to give this a go. I want to try this without my accommodations. I don't know if I really need those accommodations. And then they go and do that. Some are successful, some make that transition no problem. Many don't. And we see that. We see students that come in the week before finals and they are underwater and they are, you know, at risk of failing classes. And they're like, oh, I should have reached out earlier. I really need these accommodations. Don't be in that position. If you need to, if that's what ends up happening, fine, we will support you 100%. But it will be easier. You will have I think, a better chance at achieving your goals if you come early and often get those accommodations set up. Because also going back to what I said, your needs may change. And so having your initial set of accommodations that you have been using right along, knowing that something might shift for you, and you might experience something different because the environment is different. I think it's better to have something sort of set up, because it's then easier for us to like add in new accommodations, because we already have the background information, we already have that initial narrative, we may already have documentation that helps us determine that you're already eligible for it without even needing to get additional documentation. So just really, really important, I think, to emphasize that point early and often, and ask for help when you need it. Um, the other thing I think is really important related to that is the notification of professors. So again, student responsibility. In order to use your accommodations on any given semester, you have to notify your professor that you need those accommodations. And you do that by submitting that semester request. That semester request goes into our system and it sends an accommodation letter, which is sort of the official notification to your professor. It is vital that you don't rely on just sending an accommodation letter and just assume everything's going to be set, because that's not the way things work. Again, everything is student driven. Once you send your accommodation letter to your semester request, you are going to want to follow up with your professor to make sure that they got the letter, that they understand what you're asking for, and sometimes to have a conversation about sort of how to implement those accommodations. Nate talked about the exam proctoring center. Some professors like to proctor their own exams. Some will provide those accommodations for you in the classroom. Most are going to have you use the exam proctoring center. Some cases you might have an online testing portal, and they can build in your extra time into that online portal. So there are lots of different like sort of little nuances that go along with implementation of accommodations. And so it's just really important that you're communicating with your professor. Related to confidentiality, you do not have to explain why you need accommodation, but you do have to advocate and say, I do need this accommodation. You are welcome to share as much as you want about why you need it, but it's not required. That's our job, is to determine whether you need it. In terms of eligibility, professors, when they see that letter that says you need extended time, you need a reduced distraction environment, we are asking them to trust that we have made the right judgment. Sometimes you will get pushback. I won't. I'm not gonna sugarcoat that there are some folks that maybe don't understand accommodations and disability the way we would like. That is part of our responsibilities to support you with that. So if you do get pushback from the professors, oh, you don't need note taking, we don't take a lot of notes in this class, and you feel like you do, then you would reach out to us and we would support you with having that conversation, making sure the professor understands, like, actually, if there's any note taking, the student really does need this accommodation. Um, so notifying professors early in the semester, scheduling your exams early in the semester, getting access to notes, anything that you might need, it's just really important. Can you do it in the middle of the semester, at the end of the semester? Yeah, you can, but we want to make sure that you stay ahead of that curve. So speaking of the professor, the role of a professor at the college level is very different than the role of your teacher in high school. Um, their primary job is to get you the information you need to learn the subject that they are teaching. So they are going to create that course. They are going to provide you the materials for that course. Every course is going to provide you a course syllabus, and that is your sort of guide to that course. It's going to teach you everything you need to know about the expectations of that course. When does the course meet? Who's your professor? How do you contact them? What are their office hours when you can go and talk with them outside of class? Do they have teaching assistants that you can get additional support from? What's the attendance policy? What are their grading policies? Do they accept things late? And if so, is there a penalty for that? Do they offer extensions? Whatever the case might be, that document is really important, and they will provide that for you. Now, some professors will walk you through that, and others will just expect you to read that on your own. And so I think that is an important thing to know, is that there's going to be a lot of variation, professor to professor, class to class, even within similar subjects, which is a little wild, but is true. Different people teach different ways. And part of that is that professors in some cases are experts in their field. They are not necessarily experts in teaching. They didn't necessarily go to college to get a degree in teaching. Many professors do both things very well. They are both an expert and they teach very well. But there are lots of different people on a spectrum of teaching. And so sometimes you're going to get professors just going to come in, they're just going to give you the information, and they're going to have these expectations, and they're going to expect that you're going to follow along. For a lot of students, they're not used to that. They're used to getting prompts and getting support. There's a system in place for professors to alert you if you are struggling in their class, called an academic alert. If you fail a test, they might send you an academic alert to remind you, like, hey, I noticed you didn't do very well in this test. Why don't we have a conversation and try to figure out what's going on? That's awesome when they do that. Not every professor will do that. And so, again, it becomes really incumbent upon you as the student to make sure that you're paying attention and advocating for your needs and monitoring your progress, because the professor may not do that for you. Um, Again, I said it earlier, not all professors are understanding of disability law, of accommodations. Some professors actually think that disability, not disability, that accommodations are an advantage that are being provided to students with disabilities. We do a lot of work explaining that that is not the case. So if you run into a situation where a professor is not being responsive in the way you need them to, just know that we are here to support you, and that's part of our role, is to make sure that you don't have to do that on your own. Um, Professors can provide some support in terms of answering questions, giving you some clues about a project or a paper. Some will meet with you regularly to make sure that you're doing the things you need to do. Others will not. Um, their primary role, though, really is not to provide tutoring. It is to teach, but it's not to provide a sort of additional teaching in the event that you are not absorbing the material, as quickly maybe as you would like, or as quickly as they are expecting you to. There are services for that. We'll talk about some of them later in the presentation. But there are these other supports. If you're struggling in a class, there are supports available to support your development of skills, your ability to understand the material better. So sometimes your professor can be a great resource, and other times they just don't have enough time to do that, especially if it's a class of hundreds or many hundreds of students. They just would never have time to be able to meet with every student individually. So just know that smaller classes, they may have more time. Different professors have different ways of doing things. And then they have a lot of latitude in how they design their courses. The One of the struggles, I think, for a lot of students coming out of high school and into college is that they may bring, if they come from a smaller school, or a school that I've had students tell me they've never taken an exam before. I'm like, oh Lord, and you're a STEM student, you're going to be taking a lot of exams. So let's get you set up for that. But even with that difference, course to course, professor to professor, class to class, things can be very different. And so you just have to know that. And again, go back to your course syllabus, because that's really going to be your guide. And talk to your professor. Ask them about how they do things and why they do things a different way. Like, build a relationship with them, because it's going to benefit you down the road. Classroom etiquette. So for this, again, you're adults now. Most of you, some of you might be almost adults. Um, there are some things that are just different. You don't need a hall pass. You don't have to ask to go to the bathroom. In most cases, there might be some professors that are a little more old school that would like you to ask. But generally speaking, you can get up, take a break when you need to, go get a drink, go to the bathroom, get a snack. If you're not sure, it should be noted in your syllabus. You can always ask your professor, but generally speaking, you can sort of come and go as you need to. Course requirements. Um, so this is an area where the professor is hopefully establishing all of that stuff up front, so you know what the expectations are. If you aren't sure, you read it and you're not really sure what it means, it's really important that you don't make any assumptions. Go and talk to your professor, schedule time to really understand those expectations, because there can be a very wide variety of expectations from course to course. The grading criteria is similar, lots of different ways that professors grade. As it notes here, effort isn't necessarily going to correlate with good grades. You can work really, really hard and still struggle in a class. there are going to be these sort of performance measures, and you're going to want to know what those are. Some classes, it's like based on tests. You take three tests, and that's what your grade is. Other ones, there's participation, there's papers. So every class is going to have a different sort of expectation around grading, and you just want to make sure you really know what that is. And then I've said it a couple times, but it doesn't hurt to say it again. Being really proactive, reaching out to your professors, building relationship. So that's not just a stranger who's teaching you things, that it becomes somebody who's a part of your network who can support you when things go awry. I think if you have a relationship with a professor and something does go amiss, it's much easier to then have that conversation with them because they know you, they recognize you. Maybe they already have had a conversation about accommodations, so they understand some of your needs. Whereas, if you're in a classroom and there are 300 students and you've never met your professor, they might not even know who you are other than your name on their roll. So it's just really good. And I think that's true of any of the offices. If you think you're gonna need tutoring support, go talk to the folks at the tutoring center. If you think you're gonna, join a club, go talk to the folks and build those relationships. And that's a huge part of the college experience is developing networks and developing relationships. In terms of interactions, so I've talked a little bit about some of the differences. Lots of different folks. Professors are humans too. So there's for all the different human perspectives that I have or that you have, professors are going to fit in all of those boxes as well. So um, follow up is going to be probably the most important thing you can do when it comes to accommodations. Don't assume that because you sent your semester request that they got your letter. Don't assume that because they got their letter that everything is all set, because it isn't that way. Some professors are super proactive. They will get your letter, they will send you an email and say, this is how I'm going to do everything in my class. Other professors will not respond to your email at all. So it's important that you create that contact, that you reach out and say, hey, I want to make sure you got my letter. These are the accommodations that I'm requesting. Can we have a conversation about how this is going to work? And then I think that is just the beginning, right? That is just so you get those accommodations set up, but then continuing that conversation. If you have a paper and you get that back and the grade is not what you were hoping for, go talk with them, ask them about that, ask them what you could do differently, ask them to give you information so that you can grow and develop and get better for the next time that you do a paper for them. Um, the there are lots of ways, I think, to initiate contact. So you can just walk up to your professor and say, hi, I'm so and so, and I was hoping to set up a conversation with you. You can do that before class. You can do that after class. Most professors have office hours, so specific times that they've set up to meet with students outside of class. Some of them have really busy schedules, so maybe they can't do the conversation at the beginning of class or in class because they're rushing off to another class, or maybe you have to rush off to another class. So a lot of professors are happy to talk in person. Some like to communicate via email. So that information usually is also presented in the course syllabus. They talk about the best way to reach them or the best way to contact them. And so, pay attention to those details because I think that's really important. And in our experience, I would say that more often than not, and I would say the vast majority of the time, that when you do open the door to a relationship with your professor and talk with them about your needs and ask them questions, that is only going to benefit you. I have a hard time even thinking of a professor who just won't communicate with their students. And if that professor exists, well, maybe when you meet them, you'll be like, maybe I'll take that class with a different professor. But that is not generally our experience. Our experience is that professors want to be there. They want to help you. They want to help you learn. They want you to know what they know because that's why you're here. If you're earning a chemistry degree, the chemistry professors want you to learn chemistry so you can earn that degree. Will they be um, will they be strict, or will they have high expectations? Of course, because this is college and they have to have high expectations because you're getting a degree. But that doesn't mean they can't also be compassionate and kind human beings. And I think for the most part, the vast majority of people that teach at UVM fit into that category. All right, some success tips. So the early and often one, ask for help when you need it. Time management is so important. I cannot overemphasize this. If you have any kind of challenges with time management, any kind of executive dysfunction around prioritization, knowing what you're supposed to do when, keeping track of things, uh, that is something that you're going to want to address as soon as possible. Access the resources that are available to you here at UVM. If those resources aren't sufficient, let us know. We have access to other folks in the community that can provide supports for that. But managing your time is so important because you don't just have to go to class and do your homework. You also have to eat and you have to do your laundry. And then there's all the fun stuff that you have to do on top of that. And you're going to have to call your folks because like they are going to want to hear from you. All of that stuff adds up over time. So depending on your course load, you may have a really heavy course load, and that's going to take up a lot of your time. So you want to really be thoughtful about how are you going to manage that time. Everybody has to do college their own way. Not everybody is going to take 18 credits a semester and finish in 3 years. Not everybody's going to, take one class at a time. There's a wide spectrum of ways to get your degree. And I think because this is an investment in your future, it makes way more sense to follow your path in a way that works for you than to do what you think everybody else is doing. Because I'm going to tell you right now, they're not all doing what you think they're doing. Everybody's doing what they need to do in order to get where they need to get to. And some people take a slow roll, some people do an accelerated pace, some people are, right in the middle, and that is that sort of spectrum of possibilities. So related to that, tracking your own progress, really important. Again, some professors will tell you what your grade is. Some professors will keep you updated. They'll keep their Brightspace page up to date. Others will not. So it's important for you to monitor that and make sure you understand where you're at so that you know, do I need to ask for help? Do I need to get some tutoring support? Do I need to have a meeting with my professor? Do I need to think about, oh, maybe this course is not going as well as I'd hoped, and maybe I want to look at doing something different. There's so many different pathways. So, but you paying attention to what's going on is going to be really, really vitally important. Attendance, this is an in-person university for the most part. There are some online classes that you can take, but generally speaking, most classes are in person and professors want you to be there. Some have very strict attendance policies, some have no attendance policy. They still want you to be there. You're here, you're paying a lot of money to be here. Go to class, attend class, enjoy it. Enjoy the process of learning, engage in that process because you're going to get so much more out of it. And I'm speaking from experience. Okay. I was a student who was like not really wanting to go to class and not really wanting to do the things I need to do. And looking back, that I regret that. I regret that I wasn't in a place where I could attend as much as I needed to, that I could ask for help when I needed it. I made some mistakes. By the end of it, I figured it out and I did a better job, but it took me a while to sort of gear up. And so I had a lot of painful experiences that I would like for you to not experience. The syllabus, I've already talked about that a lot. That is your guide. If you aren't sure how to read that, again, ask for help. Talk to your professor. You can get support from different resources on campus, but that really is the thing that's going to help you understand what you need to do in every class. And then I think the other thing is that some of the skills that you have now are going to benefit you and they're going to be great. Some of the skills you have, you're going to realize are not the skills that you need. You also may discover that you don't have some of the skills that you need. That's okay. We have supports, we have resources to help you develop new skills, to help you alter skills that you have. What I always like to say is like, know what you're good at, know what you're not so good at, use your strengths to bolster your weaknesses, and then grow your weaknesses and turn them into strength. Skills development is a huge part of the college experience. It's not just all that factual knowledge that you're learning, but learning how to do things and how to communicate and how to build relationships and how to sustain those relationships, how to manage conflict. All of that is part of the college experience. So, really, really investing in the learning how to do the things you need to do in the best way is really going to benefit you. So some things to think about. So Nate talked about documentation and how sometimes, some documentation can be older and it's better to get sort of updated stuff. Because college is such a new experience, you really have to spend some time trying to figure out what is the right way for you to do college. if you have any worries coming into university about a lot of the things that we talked about, time management, the stress of new experiences, how much different the coursework is going to be, how much harder the tests are going to be, it is better to start a little bit lighter and a little bit slower because you can always gear up. And we have a lot of students that come to us and they're like they're gung ho, they're ready to go, they're ready for the college experience. They're like, I'm gonna go. And I had a student who came in with 4 lab classes on their first year course schedule, and I said, um, you have 4 lab classes in your course schedule. That's a lot of lab classes. Like 1 lab class is really hard. 2 is really, really hard. 4 is like that is, and they were like, oh no, no, it'll be fine. I love being busy. I'm really into what I'm studying. And I'm like, okay. Next time I talked with them, they were like, yep, that was a lot of work. I was not prepared for the amount of work that was there. So don't do that to yourself. Like it's okay to start a little slow. If you try to do too much too fast and then you get behind them, just everything just gets harder, right? The deeper you get into a semester, the further behind you get, it's just harder to get out of that. um, Making sure that you start strong is going to benefit you all the way through college. It's going to reduce your stress level. It's going to help you acclimate to this new environment. And you can always make up for credits. You can always take a summer course. You can always take a heavier course load down the road. But at the beginning, really, really think about, even if you are a straight A student and you have excelled at high school, this is college. There are a lot of straight A students that are coming to the University of Vermont that have excelled in high school, and they get to college and they're like, oh my, I was one of them. I had no challenges in high school when it came to getting good grades. When I got to UVM, I was like, wait, I have to study. I have to do my homework. I have to like, what? I don't want to do all this stuff. But I eventually had to because I wanted to get a degree. And so I had to learn a lot of skills that I didn't have. And so, don't do that to yourself. Be thoughtful about what you need. And I think especially if you have any kind of a disability that really affects your stamina, affects your ability to manage stress, take that into consideration. Don't underestimate how much more stressful this environment can be, how much more exhausting this work can be. It's just really important to take that under thing. Some students have, like I said earlier, like may have come from places where the classrooms are smaller, they have more contact with teachers. Uh, there are some classes at the university that are hundreds of students that are in these large lecture halls, and some of them cannot be avoided because they're like base level classes that everyone needs to take. So knowing that that is going to be potentially a class that you have to take, talk with your academic advisor about that. Try to understand, how big is this class? How many students are in this class? What is the room like? Because if you are taking a class that feels like it's going to be a new environment for you, that's going to potentially be more stressful, well, don't take 3 of those classes your first semester. Take one, and then take some classes that are maybe a little bit lighter, that have a little bit less intensity to them, so that you can manage that one really challenging class a little bit better. And then again, GPA is a thing that you're going to hear a lot of for the next 4 years. That is just sort of like how grading is done, and you've done that in high school perhaps as well. But um, getting a really good GPA your first semester is going to build your confidence. It's also going to like hopefully help to avert risk. So some scholarships are based on GPA. Some academic programs are based on GPA. And so if you overdo it and you don't get the support that you need and you tank your GPA in that first semester, that's going to just put you further behind. Then the expectations are going to change. You're going to, you may have to do additional things in order to get your GPA back up. And it's also just going to create a lot of stress. So just, really focus on doing well from the get go. And also know that what well is might be different than what you're expecting to, and that's okay. Ultimately, your goal is to get a degree. How you get there, lots of different ways. So just know that. Just know that sometimes you might have to alter your expectations. All right, back to the big picture. Uh, we take this really holistic approach at Student Accessibility Services. All of these things that you see on here are not an exhaustive list. There are so many supports on campus, but these are a few of them. There are wellness supports, there are academic supports, there are faith-based supports, there are identity supports. There are just so many resources. And when I look at this, I want you to imagine as a student, or if you're a parent thinking about your student, they're the circle in the center, right? That's the student. And they have all these different parts of themselves, some of which they're just beginning the discovery of, other ones that they know really well. I'm really into this, I'm really good at that. This is something that is important to me. There are resources for all those parts of yourself. And for us, we don't want you to just come in and be a student with a disability. You're a student. You may have a disability. Fine, we'll work with that. But you also have all of these other things that are a part of you. And we want to make sure that all of those parts of you are addressed and supported during your adventure here at the University of Vermont. This is like think of this as the long haul. These are steps towards your future. So just know that there are a lot of resources out there. And like I said, all you got to do is reach out and ask for help, and folks are going to be there to welcome you into their spaces, to offer the support that they can offer, and really help you have just an amazing experience here at UVM. So with that being said, here is all of our contact information. We're going to open things up for questions. If you don't feel comfortable asking a question in this format, you can reach out. You can email Nate and I. You can call us. You can schedule time for us to have some more of a one-on-one or a family meeting. Lots of different ways to reach out. But please, 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 if you have any questions, don't understand something, we're happy to talk about it, because there are a lot of nuances. There are a lot of there's a lot of minutia in there behind everything that we've said tonight. So really appreciate you all being here and hearing from Nate and I. We're super excited to support you on your journey at UVM. And yeah, I'll stop talking so you all can ask some questions, and Nate and I'll talk some more.
Thanks so much, Aaron. And before I forget, I'll flip back to this page in a second so you have our contact information. But I also just want to share a feedback QR code and link right there. Aaron and I tend to do this presentation on a regular basis. And so if you have any thoughts, positive, you can certainly pat our egos, but if you have suggestions and some constructive feedback for us to kind of improve next time, please feel free to scan that with your phone, or you can go to that go.uvm.edu/2026 SAS survey and give feedback there. Would really appreciate that.
Absolutely. 100%.
And I'll leave that up for a second, and I'll go back to our contact info, and then I'll just start going through some of the questions here, kind of in the order that they were submitted. So there's one here that says, I submitted the Getting Started questionnaire before the new portal came out. Do I need to resubmit through the new portal? So you do not need to do that. We are migrating information over from our old database to accommodate our new database. So if you did that once already, then I hope that you've been in touch with our office since. If you haven't, please reach out to us at access@uvm.edu. But you do not need to resubmit a Getting Started form if you submitted it prior to our transition to accommodate in the middle of May.
Yeah. Yeah, because we still have access to our old database, so we can pull information. If you submitted docs in the old database, we can pull that information. So no worries there.
There's another question here. Somebody asks, in addition to a peer note taker, can the student record the lecture? So there is an accommodation around recording a lecture, and generally there's an agreement that has to be signed by the student and the faculty member, just because each course is different, and some courses do involve some sensitive discussions that students are not necessarily evaluated on. And so in situations like that, a faculty member may say, okay, the lecture can be recorded because that's something that students are being evaluated on for an exam, but then there's a discussion portion, which is mainly about participation in the moment, and students are asked to kind of share things that they might not want to be recorded. And so it's worth noting that is one kind of proviso that can come up with that accommodation. But if the student is eligible for the ability to do audio recording of a course, that is not mutually exclusive from having a peer note taker as well. And then there's a question here about psych testing about needing to be within 3 years. And if the testing is 5 or 6 years old, would it be possible to submit for executive functioning and ADHD? So absolutely, if you have 5 or 6 year old testing, it's certainly fine to submit that. What I would recommend is if you're working with a provider like a psychologist or anyone else around that diagnosis, they can submit our academic form as well. And that's a great way, it's just like a few, 3, 4 pages long for a provider to provide up-to-date information that can kind of supplement a report that might be from, say, 7th or 8th grade. Uh, Aaron, I'll let you take this one. Does the student email the accommodation letter to each professor, or does your office do that?
Yeah, so thankfully we have this lovely new Accommodate portal. It just makes everything so in the old days, you did have to send your letters directly to your professors. You do not have to do that. Now you go into the portal, you're going to submit your semester request, which is essentially saying, here are the classes that I have, these are the accommodations I want for each of those classes. You submit that semester request, and then our system takes it from there. It's going to take those requests and it's going to send an accommodation letter to your professors. And then that's when you would follow up with your professors. So the semester request is really the thing that you want to do at the beginning of each semester to notify your faculty that you are requesting accommodations in your class. And then you would follow up with them in person via email to make sure that they understand what your needs are. I also put the OAS forms library link into the chat. So folks want to see that so they can see all the different forms. There are a lot of different forms. So if you have questions, don't hesitate to ask us.
And I see there's a question about 2 different websites were mentioned, go.uvm.edu/accommodate and uvm.edu/access. Which URL do we use for which circumstances? Really good question. So the accommodate address is really for students that are getting started with our office, submitting our getting started form or uploading documentation, or are looking to send their semester requests to faculty members. They might also be accessing notes through there as well, or making requests for accessibly formatted texts. The uvm.edu/access address is really just our website, our general website, where you can link to accommodate. You can certainly get to accommodate from there. But we have lots of other information on there as well. Some of the forms I mentioned, all the forms I mentioned actually, as far as academic accommodations or housing accommodations, are listed on there. We have information on kind of what a fundamental alteration means on there as well. We have kind of separate pages on our exam proctoring center and certain different types of accommodations as well. So I would say, for a student kind of on an individual basis to kind of get their accommodations set up, go to the accommodate website. If you are just looking for kind of generic information or just kind of wanting to dig more into kind of some of the different tentacles that are coming out from SAS, you can go to our website and navigate from there. Question here around peer support groups for students who may share similar challenges or accommodation needs. Aaron, do you want to field that one?
Yeah, so there's a couple of different things that I'll talk about. So one, within our office, we have a peer mentor program that we established a few years ago, which is an opportunity for incoming students that are utilizing our services to get connected with students that are already at the university who have already used our services and can be sort of like somebody to help guide you through the processes, give you ideas about, the best meal halls. It's just another friendly face, somebody you can connect with and build a relationship with that just sort of help with that transition to the university. So that is one resource that's available to incoming first years that utilize our services. More broadly, there's a Disabled Students Union, a student organization of students that have come together to support each other and to advocate for disability rights and disability awareness. That's another resource. And then there are a myriad of other groups through the Student Government Association and the UVM clubs system. There's a brand new organization that just started last semester called Belonging Builders, which is a group of students that were struggling with socially and really needing to get some additional support with developing relationships and communication and things like that. They form their own student organization to try to support each other, and then to again to help other students that might also have similar needs. So lots of different resources. I can post the SGA page and the Student Government Association page, and in that page you'll find the clubs and can go to the club pages. Then different clubs might even have their own websites as well. So lots of different resources. The identity centers can be another great resource. The Prism Center, the Mosaic Center, Hillel. There are all of these different of the other faith-based organizations. Lots of different ways to connect with folks with similar values, similar ideas, similar just sort of ways of thinking and being. So lots and lots of resources. That one slide with all the our little tentacles there, that has a lot of those resources on there. The UVM website's got a great search engine, so if you just sort of type in what you're looking for, that can lead you right to the web pages for different organizations. So lots and lots of resources available for students to get support from other students.
I know that there was a similar question about peer groups for students to support each other, like a group of students with ADHD to stay on track. I know Aaron's piece mentioned that, but I'll also add that one thing that I strongly recommend, Aaron was talking about kind of larger classes. The tutoring center runs supplemental instruction SI sessions. So for a lot of those larger survey courses where students can go and actually a tutor kind of basically facilitates essentially another course that's usually much smaller, where students who might not necessarily feel comfortable asking questions in kind of a larger classroom environment can go and do follow-up questions and kind of hone in on specific areas of content that they want to work on. In addition to that, one thing that we strongly recommend, and this actually goes to another question that's here about how often students can go to tutoring centers, to the tutoring center. So the study skills tutoring that's offered from the tutoring center is not course specific, but it is kind of work on those kind of executive functioning skills like time management, prioritization of tasks, things like that. And that's available for all students on campus, but students that work with our office can be eligible for additional tutoring. This is something that's already integrated into student fees, so there's not an additional cost for it that students have to pay out of pocket. So any student on campus can get an hour of study skills tutoring per week, but students that work with SAS can get additional tutoring, study skills tutoring beyond that. And that also applies to subject area tutoring. So subject area tutoring is specific to course like math. And so students that are on campus, if they're not working with SAS, can get up to an hour a week per class, but you can get additional tutoring beyond that 1 hour per week per class if you're working with SAS. So that's another advantage to working with our office, and that's part of our partnership that we've had for many years with the tutoring center. And I'll also mention tutoring is not something that should be looked at as remedial. So for students that are, doing really well, you have a B plus in a course, you can still work with the tutoring center if you want to bump that up to an A- or an A. So I strongly encourage students to make use of that and not necessarily look at it as something that's only useful if you're struggling. That's something, certainly with executive functioning, the study skills tutoring, that's something where you based on just pure intelligence can kind of get by in high school, as Aaron mentioned, but that is going to come for you in college. And so I encourage students to do that proactively. And we find statistically that the students who actually meet regularly with the tutoring center tend to use them a lot. And so that's something that I think that's in some ways they're underutilized. And so I think that's kind of a well-kept secret on campus. And so we'd like to change that. Someone asks, before I appeal my request for single room, do you happen to know if there are any still available in the Honors College dorm? Aaron mentioned appeals earlier. I actually handle the appeals. And so I'm the first step, and actually there's an additional step after that, potentially for students that are appealing. But to directly answer your question, yes, there are still single rooms available. And if you're interested in appealing, definitely encourage you to get in touch with me and kind of, as it relates to any type of appeal, whether it's for housing or for academic accommodation, the main thing I emphasize to the students is please provide me with additional documentation and narrative information, which can just, the narrative can just be in the form of an email from you as the student, but documentation from a provider. It doesn't have to be the provider that you initially submitted documentation from, but it just provides me with new information that wasn't available to the committee that kind of made the initial determination around your eligibility. Because in order for me to consider overturning a decision, I just have to have access to information that wasn't available around that initial determination. Initial question here: how many specialists in your office, Aaron?
Well, there are about to be five of us. We had one of our accessibility specialists just actually transitioned to the employee accessibility specialist role, which is a new role that was developed when we broadened into the Office of Accessibility Services in January 2025. So our good friend and colleague Susan Farrell is now doing employee and staff accommodations. Still has a small caseload of students as well, but we've just hired a new specialist, so we'll be fully staffed, and so there are five of us. Again, Dr. Laura Clemens really primarily focuses on students in the College of Nursing, College of Medicine, and Health Sciences, just because of the complexity of accommodations in those fields. But plenty of folks. We all love what we're doing. We're all very efficient at what we do, and so happy to support as many students as that need to come to us. We will find a way. And honestly, if enough students come, we'll tell the university to hire a new specialist. So we have no problem with that. We had two great candidates during our hiring search, and it would have been awesome to hire them both, but we fortunately could only hire one.
And I'll frequently meet with students as well, and we always find a way, even if a student has an assigned specialist and they happen to be out or fully booked and the student needs to get in to see somebody, as Aaron mentioned, we really support one another as a team, and we really keep our contacts up to date in our database so that if another specialist has to jump in, then they can kind of hit the ground running. And speaking of that, I realized I missed one question that was tucked away in comments to another question. There's a question about how often does a student meet with a specialist? What happens if the student is struggling? And so, as Aaron alluded to during the presentation, some students decide to kind of just have that initial meeting with a specialist and get their accommodations set up, and they're good to go. But really, it's a student can meet with a specialist as needed. They can set up appointments directly on their calendar through the Accommodate portal at any time that works for them. Also, some students opt to, just do kind of email back and forth. That's fine too. But there are some students that might meet with their specialist, a half a dozen times over the course of a semester. And there's some students that just might meet with their specialist once or twice over the course of their undergraduate career here. It really kind of just depends on the student's individual situation, but there's no specific limit or things like that. And we only really mandate that one introductory meeting. Sometimes if students are requesting new accommodations, like a housing accommodation or a parking accommodation, we do ask for students to come in for an additional meeting to provide us with a new narrative for a new accommodation request. But it's otherwise not required after that initial introductory meeting. I think for right now, that's all the questions we have. I'll give folks a moment in case there are anyone. Oh, here comes another one in. Someone asked if we haven't heard about our request for a single room accommodation. Does that mean we've been rejected? No. So you definitely, you can get in contact with us actually about that. We have a committee that meets weekly, so it's possible that you're in the queue. We actually have our housing committee meeting tomorrow. And so it's possible that as long as documentation and narrative has been provided for that request, that you'll be up for review tomorrow. But we always notify students in writing about whether or not they're eligible or not eligible. And if they're not eligible, we provide information on kind of next steps if they'd like to appeal. The one thing I should note too is that for kind of decisions about your accommodation eligibility, we basically will send is a notification that goes to your inbox and says, dear student, you have a message in your Accommodate portal, and then you can link to the Accommodate portal from that email and then find the official letter. The handy part about that is it doesn't get buried in your inbox. It's always right there in your portal. You can go at any time to find out your eligibility for kind of any type of accommodation, whether it's academic or not. So you can feel free to reach out to me directly about the status of your accommodation request, and I can give you an update on kind of where that stands and kind of what timeline to expect around housing accommodations. And I will say too, just around housing accommodations in particular, if you're just getting started with our office now and you're looking for academic accommodations and housing, I would prioritize housing accommodations, just because academic accommodations, we can kind of get those set up, up through the end of August and even, through the semester if need be. And that's a faster turnaround time. But because housing accommodations are based on a physical space, it's important to have that sooner rather than later. So it's totally fine to kind of, work with a provider to, kind of get the process started with housing accommodations for us first, and then say, later in July or August to kind of get those academic accommodations in place. That's what I would recommend if you feel like, logistically it's not practical to get both set up at the same time. If your housing accommodation was approved, when should I hear from the housing office about room assignment? It's generally within a week or two, but what you can always do is just email university housing at uvm.edu, and you can ask them for an update on kind of when to expect a placement. Usually if you kind of prompt them, if they can't give you exact information on your placement, they'll be able to give you a solid timeline as to when you can expect one. Any other questions folks have? Like I said, and Aaron mentioned this as well, do not hesitate to give us a call, send us an email to the addresses we have here. And Aaron and I will be happy to kind of answer any of your questions. And really appreciate you all making time on a Monday night to listen to us talk about accessibility. And, I think I mentioned the kind of proportion of students at UVM that use our office. And we like to think that's because we have a reputation for robust services, and we're excited to be able to, provide that to all of you in the incoming class. So thanks very much. And if you haven't, again, gotten started with our office yet, please fill out our getting started form. Otherwise, reach out if you have any questions at all at any point. And hope you all have a great rest of the summer, and we'll see you at the end of August. Take care, everyone.
Everybody.
Thank you.